Hello, my name is Alexis French, and I'm going to be talking to you about poverty and why it is a sociological issue. So, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, poverty can be defined as the state of one who lacks a usual or socially acceptable amount of money or material possessions. Poverty can also be shown in a lot more straightforward way, and this is through the federal poverty guidelines. As you can see by this graph, for a family of two, making less than $16,460 a year would put them below the poverty line. And for a family of four, making less than $25,100 a year can put them below the poverty line. As you can see, this is a very small amount of money for someone to live off of, especially someone with kids, even like infants, because things like diapers and formula and things like that can be very expensive. And this is where the problem comes in, because for somebody making a little bit over those numbers but not actually below them are not going to be involved in the stats, but they're still going to be making a very low amount of money. So the reason I chose poverty to research is because there are a lot of stereotypes involved with poverty, and I just wanted to see how real those stereotypes actually were. One of these is when you see somebody standing on the side of the road with a sign asking for money, oftentimes our first thought is that they're going to use that money for drugs or alcohol. So I wanted to see how true some of those stereotypes actually were. Another reason I chose to research poverty was because the United States is actually the 12th richest country in the world. So I wanted to look at why, if it is so rich, why is this such an issue in the United States? And lastly, I knew before I started research that child poverty was a big issue, but I wanted to look at why this was such a big issue in the United States, because many children do live in poverty, and it's actually a big amount. So this brings us to my interesting facts. The first one is according to the Washington Post, and it is that 1 in 7 children in the United States are born into poverty. So this is like a mind-blowing fact, and if you put it in context of this classroom, it means 3 or 4 of the people in this classroom would have been born into poverty. So that's really interesting to look at and see that it is such a problem in the United States today. The next fact I found was at childtrends.org, and that is the number of children who are living in poverty has increased 2% since 2008. So I thought that this issue would actually be getting better, but in reality it's actually getting worse, and the number of children who are living in poverty is actually increasing. So I thought that there would be more resources and stuff put towards these children, but it actually hasn't. The next was according to the Washington Post, and this is that 43.1 million Americans lived in poverty in 2016, so this is obviously a huge number of people. And if you think about it, like I said earlier, a lot of these people aren't even in the stats because they're technically not below the poverty line, but they're still living in a great amount, very little amount of money that they're making each year. The next fact that I found was from the Washington Post also, and that it was that more women live in poverty than men, and I thought this was interesting and found that the reason for this was because there's a lot of single mother households and a lot of mothers who are raising children, and children can be very expensive, like I said earlier. And the last fact that I found was from childtrends.org, and it is that 1/3 of the U.S. poor are children. So like I said before, this is a very big issue, and that a lot of the people that do live in poverty are children, and there's not even anything they can do about it because most of them are just born into it and are too young to help their family or make a change for their family. So some not as interesting facts. According to DoSomething.org, 40% of children that live in poverty aren't prepared for primary school. So this is why one of the big issues why children in poverty continues and is so generational is because children growing up in poverty don't get the chance to go to college or get a good education because their parents can't afford it. And so they end up growing up and not being able to get as good of jobs because they don't have the education or other requirements for these jobs, and then it just passes down to their children because they're not even able to make as much money for their children. The next fact is from povertytalks.org, and it's that 1.5 million people live below half of the poverty line. So this is kind of mind-blowing because you think about how little this is that people that are just barely below the poverty line make, So for example, for a family of 4, they would be making less than $12,430 a year, and you have to remember that there are 2 kids in that picture too. So they're barely going to have enough money for food, if they even do. So that just shows the great difference between the rich and the poor and how that problem is getting worse in our world today. The next 2 facts were found in U.S. News and World Reports, and the first is that the top 1% of the population owns 42.8% of the wealth. So this shows that while you have those extremes at the very bottom that are living at less than half of the poverty line, you also have the very extremes at the top, and that top 1% that owns almost half the wealth in the United States. This just shows how unevenly distributed the wealth is in the United States. The next fact is that Mississippi has the highest poverty rate, which I kind of found shocking. I didn't really think that would be true. I thought it would be a state with like big cities with a lot of people living underprivileged, but I don't know, it's just kind of shocking that Mississippi was up there. And then last, according to povertytalks.org, the median household income is $61,372 a year. So this just shows how you have those extreme poor and then the extreme wealthy, and how it kind of balances itself out, and just shows how there are extremes on both ends of it. So this graph kind of shows how you have that percent that's living below 50%. So the dark blue, which is the top line, represents the official poverty measure, and the light blue shows the percent of people that live below 50% of the federal poverty line. And I think that this is actually concerning, because if you actually look at the light blue line, it's slowly been increasing over the years. So it shows that there are the people that are living below 50% of below that poverty line is actually increasing, whereas I thought it would be getting better because of some of the resources we have for those people, but in reality it's just getting worse. This next graph shows the percent of people that live in poverty by state. I know some of the colors are hard to read, so I'm just going to point out some of the states that you guys are probably interested in. So Ohio has 13% to 15.9% of people living in poverty. Mississippi, which I mentioned before is the state with the highest poverty rate, is in the category of 18% or more people living in poverty, along with New Mexico, Kentucky, and Louisiana. The reason I chose poverty the reason poverty is a sociological issue is because many of the people that are living in poverty are not living in poverty because of addiction or substance abuse, while there are some people that are, and that's often what we think when we see someone in poverty. There are a lot of people that are living in poverty because of reasons they can't control, and one of these groups of people is children. Because they are, like I said before, they're put in a situation where they don't get the education, they don't get the resources that they need to help themselves in the future, and they're oftentimes taken out of school to work because their family can't make enough money to keep their house or provide food, so those kids are just put in situations where they can't help themselves in the future. Another reason that it's so generational is because the lack of work and the extent of low-wage jobs. So people that are living in poverty oftentimes are stuck in that minimum wage job or below minimum wage job because they don't have the requirements or the education to get a better job and help themselves. So they're stuck there, and it just is a cycle that continues over and over for generations. So my opinion on poverty is that it's a very complex topic, and there's a lot that goes into it that I didn't even have time to get into in this presentation that we don't think about, and that there is more that society could be doing for the poor, but there's also more that the poor could be doing for themselves in society, and it kind of goes both ways, and there is it's not something that's going to get fixed overnight, but it for sure, with the steps being taken, it could be improved, and especially if you look at some of the stats, there are things that we could be doing to help people in poor that we're not doing. So these are my references, and you guys have any questions? Ms. Nancy.
My question is, do you think that education is the key to getting out of poverty?
I think that it is a huge factor to it, and if you can help to educate those people, those children that are in poverty, it could definitely help them a ton in the future, especially with college degrees and things like that, because a lot of higher paying jobs that's what they're looking for now is a college degree, and those people aren't getting a chance to even go to college, and oftentimes are dropping out of high school or even like lower grades than that. So yeah, I think education is a big factor to it. Oh, go ahead.
Now that you've like done this presentation and like researched poverty, do you feel more obligated than you did before to like give back to them and kind of help them out a little more?
For sure. I didn't realize before how big of an issue it actually was. I knew it was an issue just because you see things and you're like, oh, there's a lot of people living in poverty. I knew it was an issue before, but after like seeing how like staggering some of these stats are, it's like kind of mind-blowing and makes me want to like do something about it. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You talked about how the children live in poverty has gone up. Do you think that has any correlation, not with us not trying to put more money into programs, but the population boom that we're having?
Yeah, for sure, because you think about it and you have parents who are having like more children, and that's just increasing that number more and more, which is causing the numbers to rise, but also making it a bigger issue and making child poverty go up, and also putting those people they're still making the same amount of money, but they're having more kids, so it's just giving those kids less for their future.